We spanked our child for 4 hours straight.
What will you learn? That your actions have consequences!
So I recognize that I took that clip out of context. I'm going to be showing the entirety of what Lori said in today's video. But as you all know, before we get into that, we have to celebrate some fan art. First of all, we have a Hoverload Suris by May, a very angry dragon Suris by Grandma Tempo, and then me kicking the crap out of BGR because of his video about diddling kids. That one is from Jack and Quill. Alrighty, as always everyone, thank you very much for your fan art submissions. I keep getting messages about where to send fan art. The best way to do that is to send it to the fan art section in the Discord, which is listed down below. And with that said, let's talk about spanking, and not the fun kind.
I'm in a private chat room, and we try to keep the trolls out, but we can, of course. There'll always be chaff among the wheat until Christ returns. And they grabbed some screenshots of things that I wrote a long time ago. And one of the screenshots said, and this is what it in quotes, "We spanked our child for 4 hours straight." And that just blew up. I've gotten so many hateful, cruel comments. I'm going to report you to the police. I'm going to take away your children. You beat your child with a belt for 4 hours. And it was even shared in some Christian groups.
Well, yes, if you're going to tacitly admit that you decided to spank your child for 4 hours, that would go well over and above any standard disciplinary action that would be allowed for a parent, I'd imagine. And that's in the small pockets of people that still think spanking is a good idea. But I've got a bunch of studies for that, so let's go ahead and get into the rest of our video, and then I'll bring up the evidence that I found on the topic.
But if they just thought, if there was just, what happened to common sense?
I've got some common sense for you. Is your child of the age where they have the common sense to determine whether or not they should do something? If no, should you resort to spanking? Does your child have the common sense to understand why they're being spanked? Well, no, because they would be being spanked if the thing they're doing is wrong, but they don't understand that the thing they're doing is wrong. So again, are they of the age where they can understand why you're spanking them? If the answer is no, maybe hitting your child isn't the best thing to do. There are other forms of disciplinary action. It's not your child's fault that you're not creative.
They just took a minute to think about it.
As opposed to the 240 minutes you said you spent spanking your child, right?
How could anyone possibly spank their child for 4 hours straight?
Then why did you say that you did?
Physically. They can't. No one has the strength or the endurance, unless you're just a world-class athlete, to spank a child for 4 hours straight. A wise person would have looked at that and thought, that couldn't be possible. She must have either greatly exaggerated what she wrote or misspoke. And that's exactly what happened. I misspoke.
Okay, yes, but there's still the underlying issue of the spanking thing, and I recognize this is a controversial issue for people because many people grew up being spanked as a form of punishment. But unfortunately, the scientific data for that isn't actually in the favor of spanking. So even if we grant that you misspoke, you still mentioned that you were going over and above the call of any parent in eliciting corporal punishment for your child.
In the chat room, I'm not as careful about what I write. I just, I'm writing on so many different social media sites, blogging, mentoring, that I'm not always careful and exact in the words that I write.
Well, I'm glad that you're using the same type of excuses that Donald Trump is using for his lack of memory of firing the entire pandemic team before coronavirus hit. Believe me, I can empathize. I'm on almost 100 different Discords, multiple private chats on Twitch, Kick, Facebook, Amino, and other social media apps. I don't script my videos, so I have everything that I say unfiltered here on my channel, and this isn't even counting the countless different venues that I have for conversation in real life. Between the mall, card shops, various places with family and friends, I can empathize the feeling of being pulled in many social directions. But here's the thing, in my experience, being pulled in those directions has shown me that being a different person in each one of those venues is not exactly a good or healthy thing. It's like wearing a mask at every different venue. It's not healthy, and if you're in a position where you can safely remove that mask, then you might as well do so. What is more likely to happen, at least in my case, is that I'll forget where I said something and in what chat. But as far as the person that I am, that doesn't change terribly much place to place. And if you're feeling like your opinions have to be filtered on the internet, but they don't have to be filtered in your private chats, then I have to wonder, what opinions are you filtering? They can't be any worse than the shit you say online.
So instead of pondering if what I said was true, they just came to the worst possible conclusion and blew it all out of proportion.
I'm glad to know that the worst possible conclusion is taking what you said at face value. Like, taking the words you said literally is the worst possible conclusion. If, by taking what you said literally, people can come to the worst conclusion, then maybe what you said is more than a little fucked up.
Yeah, each of our child, when they were between 18 months to 2 probably, we can't really remember the age. It was over 30 years ago, so our memories aren't exact. But they would have their first temper tantrum. And we would tell them to either pick up their toys or pick up their raisins or do whatever we were asking them to do, or not get out of their playpen. And they would refuse. They refused to obey us. And so we would spank them.
I'll be referencing a handful of studies on this topic, and you'll notice that several of these are a handful of decades old. I'll be bringing up the dates so you can know when and where this information was available, so that if Lori ever sees this video, she can't say that this is all recent information or new age nonsense or liberal propaganda or whatever the hell she wants to say. This is old information. In a journal titled Social Competence in Children, it was found that spanking is a generally ineffective form of punishment. This is because unlike other forms of punishment, it's corporal. It involves hitting. And violence is linked to a separate part of the brain than other forms of punishment. Hitting a child causes physical pain, which can be confusing and frightening for the child, especially when they're being hit by someone they're supposed to love and respect. Moreover, they can't escape this because they are also dependent on that. Children in studies reported fear, anger, and sadness when they are spanked. That information comes from a 2006 study, which I will also be linking down below. These confused feelings that are linked to being hit by someone they're supposed to love and trust end up causing confusion where the internalized disciplinary message cannot actually be read and understood by the child. That information comes from impact of parental discipline methods on the child's internalization of values. Again, that'll be linked down below. This means that spanking will ultimately be ineffective because the child can't understand why they're being hit, especially at a young age. They couldn't understand why what they're doing is wrong in the first place, and that should have been your indicator that they also wouldn't understand that they were being hit because something was wrong. They just understand that they're being hit. That violence temporarily stops annoying behavior, I'm sure, but parenting is a long-form process. You're in it for the long haul with your kid. Temporarily stopping bad behavior isn't what you're going for. You're going for long-term molding. But it gets worse. It's not just that spanking is ineffective, it also causes adverse effects. In the journal article Social Competence in Children, published all the way back in 1986, well within the time you would have been raising your kids, it was found that children who are spanked are more likely to attribute hostile intentions to others. These attributions, in turn, increase the likelihood that they will behave aggressively in social interactions. This is because, again, if we are to use common sense, your child is seeing you enact violence to solve your problem. Developmentally, this means that your child will now see violence as a problem-solving technique. Oh, but it gets even worse. In an even older study published in 1971, it was found that teaching children that it's acceptable and reasonable for the person in charge to use violence to get what they want shows that violence is sometimes a part of loving relationships. This message then perpetuates the transmission of violence in families across generations, and then to add to the confusion shown in the other studies I cited, this leads to the child dealing with a very hypocritical do-as-I-say, not-as-I-do form of parenting. That information comes from Learning of Aggression in Children, published in 1971, which an Amazon link to the book will be available down below, because while I could not find a digital version for the book, it has been cited at time of speaking 454 times. I bring up all this information to show that not only will spanking cause adverse effects in your children, not only does it not accomplish what you're actually trying to do, not only does it show a lack of creativity on your part as the parent, but that all of this information has been available for decades. this isn't new information. And even when you get an article that takes a more neutral stance, like the Clinical Psychology Review, published in 2003, it notes that even viewed in neutrality, that means even if there were no negative effects associated with spanking, it would still not be a good idea, because spanking does not actually yield the results you're looking for. Your goal as a parent is to mold your child into a functional member of society so that they can function on their own. Spanking your child, or any form of physical violence against them, doesn't actually teach them how to do this. It just stops them from doing something that is problematic for you, and isn't even an effective way of doing that long term.
Yes, some of you, a lot of people today think that spanking a child is abuse. We don't. We think it's biblical, and we think it works, and it's good.
Well, there's a reason I did that giant information dump earlier, to show that no, it actually doesn't work. It is a temporary solution to a long-term problem. There are other forms of punishment that are less confusing to a child in the 18-month range that you gave, and like I said before, it's not your child's fault that you lack the creativity in how to punish them without hitting them. You can make your home safe by child-proofing it, for instance. There are many actions, like breaking dishes or getting into cabinets and stuff like that, that can cause a child to get spanked by an overzealous parent. Properly child-proofing your house can prevent these issues. You can find a diversion for your child if they're too young to understand that a punishment is because of the action that they just made. The punishment will pacify the child temporarily, but it won't actually solve the problem. You can find creative ways to teach a child why what they're doing is wrong, not that doing it will lead to punishment, because at that point, you're just teaching the child to do it and avoid being caught. Your child doesn't want to go to his room when it's his bedtime. Instead of spanking them, just remember that you're an adult. You're bigger than your kid. Literally, pick them up and take them there. It's not hard. Time out is also fairly effective. Again, there are several things you can do that don't involve hitting your child, which are effective forms of punishment. Demonstrate through your actions the kind of behavior that you want your child to emulate. And I know I'm going to get at least one person in the comment section telling me that I'm not yet a parent, I don't understand. And you're right. I don't understand what lengths one has to sink to feel like they should hit their kid. And I think I'm better off never understanding that.
Anything that God says is good, we believe is good. I'll put a link to a blog post that I wrote recently about all the verses of the rod.
You provide a self-reference, I provide studies. Which do you think is actually more effective at demonstrating the truthfulness of your statement?
Below this video. But we did spank our children. We didn't hardly ever spank after 4 years old, but we were never abusive. And no, I never spanked a child for 4 hours straight. For one thing, I was an ill mother. I would never have had the physical endurance to be able to do that. And I would never do that to my child. I never abused my children in any way. I never pulled their hair, never slapped them.
But you did slap them. You just think that there's a fundamental difference between where you slapped them and how much that matters.
Never bit them, never anything that was abusive. We spanked mostly on the bottom, sometimes on the upper thigh, and sometimes we smacked their hand.
What's the difference between a smack and a slap? Or is this another moment where you've misspoken?
And that was it. And we only did it for clear obedience. We didn't do it often. We didn't do it in anger. We did it when it was clearly needed.
So we're going to do another appeal to common sense here, because I can cite a bunch of studies at you, and I already have, and I don't think there's going to be any more worth to doing that. Let's take every parent who has ever spanked their child, every parent who has not read studies on the negative effects of spanking and viable alternatives. Every single one of those parents, more than likely, on some level, viewed that they only spanked their child when it was necessary, when it was needed. But now, if we take those same parents, these hypothetical people, and put them in a room and have them discuss when they spanked their kid, I highly doubt all of them would agree with each other on when spanking was necessary. One parent might view spanking as necessary when a child comes home with bad grades. Another parent might view spanking as necessary when they aren't obeying the parent explicitly. One more parent might find that spanking their child when they found out they were gay was when necessary. Almost as if I only spanked when necessary is a really bad litmus test, and we can't actually determine when that is. And again, with the negative effects that come from spanking, you would only be able to view it as a last resort, which luckily, as noted during the Spare the Rod, Spoil the Child section of the Clinical Psychology Review article that I'll be linking down below, it often is viewed as a last resort. But again, what you and I consider a last resort will be very different things. And because because of that, it seems that, again, in light of all the negatives, spanking shouldn't be viewed as a viable option. Because when a last resort has been reached, it's not clearly defined, and cannot be clearly defined, and it's based solely as a matter of perspective amongst different parents. And that's hardly a path to find any kind of truth from at all.
And the first temper tantrum our children had was their last temper tantrum. We dealt with it, and we dealt with it firmly. And we sat with them, or, we would tell them to pick it up, and they wouldn't. So we would spank them, then we would wait a while, and they would be crying. Then we'd tell them, okay, pick it up, and they wouldn't. So we'd spank them. So it wasn't 4 hours. I think one of them took about 4 hours.
So you mean you did spank your child for 4 hours, you just took breaks? I'm not sure if you're aware, but that doesn't make it much better. Moreover, there's a bit of a strange dichotomy here where you can't remember it very well because it was 30 years ago, and it only happened once. I'm very sure of that.
I'm not even sure on the time. Maybe it is an exaggeration. It just seemed like a long time at that time. I don't know if I ever clocked it.
But we do know you clocked your kid.
But we did that until the child picked up their raisin, picked up their toys, or stopped getting out of their crib. That's how we did it. And know what? They never had a temper tantrum after that, ever. We didn't have to do grounding as they got older. We didn't have rebellious teenagers. We enjoyed our children. It was a pleasure. They obeyed us. They learned to obey us young. It was a battle of the wills when those temper tantrums roared their ugly heads, and we made sure that their rebellious will didn't win. We wanted good children. We wanted obedient children. If you discipline your children when they're young, they'll grow up to be disciplined adults.
In most cases, yes, I agree. But again, you can be creative with your methods of discipline. You don't have to resort to just hitting your kids. There are other, more effective long-term solutions. Merely pointing out that your situation turned out positively as an anecdote doesn't really get us anywhere. Then again, the conservative, well, I've got mine, screw you mentality never got us anywhere.
And they are. And if you asked any of our children if they were abused, they would say not in any way. Because we loved our children. We're not abusive. We're not mean. We're not mean or unkind parents in any way.
It's funny, an abuser can also still love you. It's one of the reasons why people get tangled up in abusive relationships long term. The love is there, and people stay for the love, even though the pain and abuse happens anyway. This isn't a black and white thing. Even when that love is twisted and contorted by abuse, the fact that it's there can even cause people to not realize they are being abused. A Christian wife who constantly has sex with her husband even when she doesn't want to might not realize that her husband is engaging in a form of sexual abuse, especially when she tells him no and he takes her anyway. Her anecdotal perspective doesn't change the fact that that's what's happening.
We believe in God. We believe that His ways work. And spanking has been around for generations and generations. It's legal in every single state.
Oh boy, two fallacies at once. The first one was an appeal to law. This is when you assume that the law is the morally correct thing to do. The counterexample is always something like, say, slavery. It's a form of the appeal to authority fallacy. You also made an argument from antiquity. Because it was good for thousands of years, it must still be good now, even though that's not the case. Again, an appeal to antiquity can cause someone to justify slavery. If they want to build a new nation now, using the methods used from before must be the morally right thing to do. Ignoring the fact that it wasn't right then either, our understanding of what was right and wrong hadn't evolved quite to the point that we are at now. Two fallacies in the same statement. Grats. You did it. You really did it.
And for a reason, it works. Of course, it's probably not going to be for long because we're in such a progressive culture that's abandoning God and His ways. Most of these women who don't believe in spanking, now I'm not saying all of you, but a lot of them who raged on me for abusing my children will believe it's okay to slaughter babies in the womb.
And now we have whataboutism, or tu quoque. My position can't be morally wrong because your position is morally wrong. You're 0 for 3, Lori. Stop it. Get some help.
Which I think that's evil. Spanking children on their bottoms for clear disobedience is not evil. It's biblical, and it's what God calls us to do.
Fun fact, the God of the Bible is an abuser. There's also a case to be made that he's a yandere, but the link to that is below. But that's all of Lori's video that we'll be getting into today. The last 30 seconds of that don't matter terribly much, it's just her talking about a conversation she had with the pastor. So, what are my final thoughts on this? Well, for one, I think that it's very hard for anybody who's actually used to spanking to do anything besides appealing to antiquity or the law, or appealing to an anecdote to justify their position. Most of the conversations I've had about this usually tend to end up being something like, my dad did it to me, or my mom did it to me, and I turned out fine. But honestly, if you grew up thinking it's okay to hit your child, then you didn't turn out fine. You just ended up perpetuating the cycle of violence. I apologize that this has been normalized for you. But anyways, that was the video. If you guys enjoyed it, then let me know in the comment section below or hit a like button. And if you disagree with me, which I'm sure a bunch of you will, then let me know why in the comments below. Please also let me know if you found any of the cited articles useful or helpful, and if you haven't subscribed already, then please do so. There's also a Patreon link and everything else that's usually down there. As always everyone, insert end of video tagline here.